Hi, I'm Dio, and welcome to Court Watch, where we talk about the importance of keeping eyes on the judicial system. We advocate for vulnerable people targeted by this system and explore the best ways to protect ourselves and each other while we work to abolish the system. I'm not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. My experience and knowledge is most relevant to New York State, and variances may occur depending on the laws where you live. So, today we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of doing an actual court watch. So, a brief recap summarizing some of the previous videos, I talked about ways to find out when a case is being heard. Some jurisdictions, like New York City and Rochester, New York, have a specific housing court. And so advocates can literally just stand outside of the housing court building and talk to people going in to ensure that they know their rights and then just, go into the housing court and sit and observe cases. However, most of New York State, like where I live in the capital region, we don't have that. So all the civil trials and hearings happen in one courtroom. So you might go into a courtroom before a hearing and have 20 people sitting there. Some of them are there for small claims cases. Some people might be there for evictions. Some are there because of other types of lawsuits. And so it's not as easy to know who to approach if you want to advocate for tenants, which I'll talk about in more detail in a minute. But just in terms of getting leads, another way you might get a heads up about a case is by organizing with tenants in your building if you're a renter. And in the future, I hope to do a video specifically about the importance of tenant organizing and tenant unions. But these days, if you're connected to other tenants in any way, trust me, you're eventually going to hear about somebody having an eviction coming up because that's how common this pipeline has become. So you also might get referrals from local tenants' rights groups, especially if people get to know you and see that you watch court and you're a tenant organizer or a tenant advocate or just an interested person who's taken an interest in this issue. And last but certainly not least, you can use a website called Web Civil Local, and I'll put that in the description below. So Web Civil Local gives you a glance at the upcoming court calendars for civil cases in a given demographic. So you might type in City of Albany, City of Saratoga Springs, etc., and you'll see the names of the judges. You can click on a judge's name to get their calendar. And so there's different ways to search to see what cases are being heard. Now, as a hint, eviction cases have a docket number that begins with LT for landlord tenant. So remember, rural areas are not always plugged into the virtual court calendars. They're extra sneaky. So sometimes you just have to call the court and say, what days do you hear eviction cases? And then show up at that date and time. So, like for where I am in the capital region, Saratoga Springs has their court calendar online. But if you're looking at some of the outside small towns and villages, like the town of Saratoga, Malta, some of these other places, Wilton, Milton, their court calendars are a little bit harder to find, and you just have to, find out the information, call them, and the clerk will tell you, oh, we hear evictions on Tuesdays between 11 and 4 or whatever. So some of the outlying places go a little bit under the radar, and you have to do a little bit more work to find out when they're hearing cases. So here's a rundown of what I do. And bear in mind, do what works for you, especially because where you live, the atmosphere might be different. You might have different interests. So this is just a guide. Use this based on your comfort level. So I'll often hear about eviction cases through the grapevine because I've been interacting with tenants and tenant orgs for a couple of years. When someone tells me that they know someone who's being evicted or they make like a specific referral, I try my best to go and observe if I'm able to. But let's say I'm going in cold and I don't have any specific cases that I want to watch. I'll go to Web Civil Local and look to see what days the court is hearing a lot of eviction cases, and that also correspond with my schedule. So, in particular, there's a few judges that I've gotten to know, not that I know them personally, but I've gotten to know that they don't have a good reputation when it comes to tenants. So I try to prioritize keeping an eye on their cases. So if you're brand new, you might not know one judge from another, and that's fine. Just start with what works for your schedule. You'll get to know as you spend time observing. You'll get to know. So I try to prioritize the most horrible judges who are notorious for being pro landlord, and I see when their cases start. Now, let's say a judge who hears morning cases starts at 9 a.m. and runs till 1 or 2. I'll try to get there at maybe 8:30 or even 9 o'clock on the dot. In my experience, going to court is a lot like going to DMV. Even if somebody has an appointment, they don't always run on time. And there can be a lot of downtime as tenants and landlords are conferencing with lawyers and things are going on behind the scenes. So it's not always like exactly starting on the dot. In fact, it seldom is. So if you're an advocate, this is to your advantage. There's often downtime between hearings or before they start, and that's when I try to have conversations with tenants. So I will walk into the court, I'll bring a notebook, a few pens, and a handout that I've put together that has a checklist of things tenants may be able to use to get more time or a possible dismissal, and also phone numbers for legal aid and any tenant attorneys in this area. There's one who's not, if you don't qualify for legal aid, you have one option, who is someone who strictly represents tenants, not a landlord attorney who once in a while will represent a tenant. Depending on where you are, you might be blessed with more available attorneys, but generally speaking, that's often not the case. But bring any resources you have, and if you don't have any yet, don't worry, you'll develop them over time. So, the checklist that I'll go into more detail in another video, this was provided by a tenants' rights group. And so you can check with groups in your area for any kind of resources that you can share, or you can ask a lawyer friend to help you make your own checklist. But really important, anything I hand out clearly states this is not legal advice. And one of the first things I tell people is I'm not a lawyer and this is not legal advice. So I travel light when I go to court because I hate going through metal detectors and dealing with cops. And most of the time, they will have a metal detector if you're going to court. If you bring a phone, they will ask you to silence it. And I should tell you that recording in a courtroom without permission is a serious crime in New York State. I won't tell you whether or not to do it, but just know that there are serious consequences. If you're media, and you get advance permission, they will sometimes allow that. But we can talk more about that in another video. Unless you're a member of the media with permission in advance, they're probably not going to let you just bring in your laptop to take notes. So that's why I am old fashioned with the pen and paper. So when I go into the courtroom, I'll approach the people that are just kind of sitting around waiting for things to start, and I'll say, "Are you a tenant facing eviction?" If they say no, okay, have a nice day, and I move on. If they say yes, my second question is, "Do you have a lawyer?" Most of the time, the answer sadly is no. Sometimes the answer is, I called legal aid, but they don't have capacity or they don't have someone to come today. In which case, I'll encourage them to do the same thing that legal aid probably told them to do, which is to ask for what's called a 14-day adjournment. Now, again, this may be a specific thing in one state and not another, so this is not legal advice. It's not across the board. However, in New York State, it's a common practice for a judge to grant a 14-day adjournment and reschedule the tenant to come back in about 2 weeks. This gives the tenant time to get a lawyer and get more of their paperwork and things like that together. But it's worth noting, most judges don't offer this out of the kindness of their heart. They don't usually default hand these out, and you often have to ask for a 14-day adjournment, and even then, the judge may not grant it. If a tenant does not have a lawyer, does not qualify for legal aid, and is of the opinion that they can resolve their issue easily and they don't want to pursue a lawyer, I might suggest they take a look at the checklist anyway, as they might be able to advocate for themselves based on some of the criteria on the list. So, if someone's really sure that they're fine, they've got a new place, they just want to get this over, or they think they're going to be able to resolve it with their landlord, I try not to push too much, but I just want to make sure that they're aware of their rights. So I might leave it with them just in case they want to take a look at it anyway. And I don't think I've ever had anyone refuse it. And in the future, we'll go into the weeds more about the checklist and some of these criteria. Um, but as an example, there are some technicalities regarding the way information is served to you or not. If you're a tenant, and that can actually get a case thrown out. Although, depending on who the judge is and if they're willing to follow the rules. These are not always guarantees. So, aside from that, I might talk with the tenant a little bit, try to see what their situation is, and find out if there's any other resources that I know about that might be helpful to them. Now, if you're shy and you're not interested in approaching people, I get it. It can be anxiety provoking, and just know that being there to observe is also a big help. So, when the court is called to order, that's when you'll be expected to stop any conversations and sit down and watch. Court officers will often approach you to ask what you're there for. But this is a formality because if you are a party to a case, they want to make sure that they're accounting for who's arrived and who's ready for their hearing and so forth. Um, Usually telling a court officer, I'm here to observe, or if the judge asks in a smaller court, oh, I'm just here to observe, that should be all you need to say. If you tell a judge or a court officer that you're an observer and they try in any way to make you leave the courtroom, that is illegal and should be documented, including the officer's name and badge number and the name of the judge if the judge is trying to impede you from observing. While a case is in session, I try to document the time a case begins and the time it ends, as much detail as I can scribble, including the landlord's name, their attorney's name, the tenant's name, and the tenant's attorney if they have one. The judge's name I also try to make a note of. I try to write down any pertinent facts of the case, as well as any red flags. Red flags could be egregious things the attorney, landlord, or judge says or does. And again, I'll get into this more in another video just because I don't want to get too into the weeds with too much information at once. But you'll start to see what things are egregious red flags, and then other things you'll see might seem like they should be illegal, but are unfortunately not. So sometimes it takes a little bit of, experience and practice, or even like doing a sidebar with, if you have lawyer friends and you can run things by them and say, hey, this happened in court. Is that allowed? You might be shocked at some of the things that sadly are allowed. But you'll see some things that are also pretty blatant red flags. So I try to keep track of those as well. Over time, you'll see patterns with how certain attorneys act. Yes, there's a lot of attorneys kind of brand themselves as the local landlord attorneys. So you'll see a lot of repeat offenders when it comes to egregious attorneys. You'll see that some of the landlords are the most notorious evictors who are more likely to push people out of their homes for incidental things that could easily have been resolved. And you'll also get to compile documentation that could be helpful to tenants' rights groups in their lobbying or direct action strategies, or just in other ways to tenants in your community. So, in a later video, we'll talk about what to do with the information you've gathered, but for now, this is just the ins and outs of what to do when you're there. So, keep in mind when trials or hearings or anything is going on in court, you can get up and leave at any time. So also, if you're running late to court, as long as you're just there to observe and not a party to the case, you can come in late and it's okay. It happens all the time. Sitting in court is like sitting in a doctor's waiting room. They don't like noisy disruptions, but people come and go, and lawyers are always coming in and grabbing people to pull them out in conference with them, and the judge may even hear a few cases and then go into the mysterious room behind the door, and you may be sitting there for 20 minutes or a few hours, just kind of waiting for the next thing to happen. So kind of anything goes, right? So another scenario that if you're advocating for tenants, what might happen is you talk to a tenant, they have not contacted legal aid, they might not even know that legal aid exists. And so that's where I have the phone number on me and I'll say to them, hey, before anything starts, first thing, this is the best time to call them and see if they can do an intake with you. And if you qualify, then you can tell the judge, hey, I just spoke to legal aid and I'm requesting my 14-day adjournment so I can come back with the lawyer they're assigning to me. And that can be extremely, extremely, extremely helpful. Sometimes I will step outside in the hallway and make the phone call with the person if they are really having a hard time with that for whatever reason, because sometimes that happens. Um, so that alone, if you're able to do it, and if there is a resource in your community like legal aid, just getting people to call that number and get an intake and get a lawyer assigned to them, and then to be able to tell the judge, hey, I've got a lawyer, they're just not here today. Or maybe, sometimes even better, that lawyer is in court that day, and then they can just, boom, represent the person on the spot. That alone can slow down the pipeline and can make a huge difference in a tenant's life and in the outcome that they end up with. So When it comes to the observation end of things, another thing I like to take note of is if a case is particularly troublesome, if the landlord is like really off the wall and this case has like some really egregious details to it, the tenant might get an adjournment or a follow-up date for a trial. And so I like to make note of their follow-up date and then go to that as well, and even try to get some other people to come with me and observe. I do this not only to continue documentation, but so that the tenant walks into court and there's a familiar face there, so they have some extra moral support. And that can be a big deal when you're facing losing your home. And many people I meet in court tell me this is their last step before homelessness. So it is a pretty traumatic situation. Sometimes a court will have only a few eviction cases, and I'll leave after they're all done. And sometimes it's packed and I have to just leave at a certain time, so I just stay as long as I can and then step out when when I am able to. Um, so the bottom line is do what you can, leave when you have to leave, do what you're comfortable doing, and then if you get comfortable being an observer and you're ready to talk to people, give that a try. Thanks so much for watching. And now that you have the tools to start, let's keep eyes on the courts.